Imagine your country disappeared overnight. Your flag, your leaders, all gone. That's what happened to nearly 300 million people when the Soviet Union collapsed. An empire vanished, gangsters rose, and ordinary Russians were left behind. What followed was one of the worst peacetime disasters of the 20th century, a decade the world forgot. So why has no one told their story? On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're looking at why no one talks about what happened to Russians after their country collapsed. To understand the collapse, you first have to know what came before it. The Soviet Union wasn't a country in the modern sense. It was an entire economic and social experiment that tried to stretch beyond culture and nationality, and somehow it managed to stay afloat for nearly 7 decades. From 1922 to 1991, the USSR ran a command economy, where the state controlled everything: the factories, the farms, and businesses. And it decided what got produced, how much, and at what price it was sold. Citizens didn't need to worry about unemployment because their jobs were guaranteed by the state. Housing was provided, though it was usually in massive concrete apartment blocks. Basic goods like bread, milk, and medicine were heavily subsidized to keep prices low. Healthcare and education were free. Sure, the system had plenty of problems: constant shortages, awful product quality, and almost no political freedom, but for the average Russian, life was predictable, and it wasn't a bad thing. They knew they'd have a job, a place to live, and food on the table. By the late 80s, it was clear the Soviet dream of unity had turned into an impossible balancing act. The country's obsession with opposing the West came at a huge cost: endless spending on nuclear weapons, the Chernobyl cleanup, and a grinding war in Afghanistan that had dragged on for over a decade. The combination of political and economic failure made the country unstable, and its people were no longer cut off from the outside world. They had seen how others lived, and they weren't willing to quietly accept the status quo anymore. Then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms called perestroika and glasnost, aimed at modernizing the economy and allowing more openness. But instead of injecting new life into the system, the reforms put it on life support. In 1991, after a failed coup and growing pressure from independence movements in places like Ukraine and the Baltic states, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. On December 26th, it officially dissolved, leaving behind 15 new countries built from the wreckage. Russia, the largest of them, was left to figure out what came next, and it wasn't good. Economic devastation on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime tore through the country. Russia's GDP plummeted by at least 40% between 1991 and 1998, with some sources suggesting it hit 50% from 92 to 98. The sudden contraction of the economy echoed the Great Depression in the United States, but it happened faster, hit harder, and it came with no wartime recovery to pull the country back from the brink. The Soviet system of state-run industries was dismantled almost overnight in a process known as shock therapy. Western advisors, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, persuaded Russian leaders that the fastest way to build a market economy was through rapid privatization. State-run factories, mines, and resources were either sold off or given away to private owners in a matter of months. The idea was that private ownership would help boost efficiency and prosperity. But no one counted on the rampant corruption. Government insiders and well-connected criminals snatched up the most valuable assets for pennies on the dollar. Within a few years, a handful of men became billionaires, taking control of the oil fields, aluminum plants, and factories that had once belonged to the state. Meanwhile, ordinary workers found themselves unemployed or working for owners who turned from socialist policies into capitalist ones. The old Soviet social contract that guaranteed jobs even when productivity was low vanished almost overnight. And then came the inflation. In 1992 alone, prices in Russia increased by over 2,300%. If a loaf of bread cost 1 ruble in January, it cost 24 rubles by December. People's savings were practically worthless. Elderly Russians who had worked for decades found their pensions could barely cover a week's worth of groceries. Hyperinflation destroyed the middle class before it could even have a chance to form. Salaries went unpaid for months at a time. Teachers, doctors, factory workers, and government employees would show up to work with no guarantee they'd be paid. Some people received their wages in goods instead of money. Teachers were paid in vodka bottles that they'd then have to sell on the street to get cash for food. By 1994, unemployment had soared past 8%, a figure unheard of in a society that had never known joblessness under the Soviet system. And it only got worse. By 1998, unemployment peaked at around 13%, and then stabilized there, if you can call widespread poverty stable. To put things into perspective, even the European Union faced high unemployment during the 90s, around 13% across much of the decade. But unlike Russia, most European countries avoided runaway inflation. Families could still rely on their savings, and social systems were flexible enough to handle job losses without total economic collapse. But in Russia, unemployment plus inflation and sudden systemic changes was a massive shock. Even basic goods became scarce or unaffordable. Store shelves, which were already poorly stocked during Soviet times, were now bare. The distribution networks that had moved food and products across the country collapsed. People stood in lines for hours hoping to buy bread, milk, or medicine. The black market became the only way to get basic goods, and prices there were often higher than in official stores. And then the poverty rate exploded. By the mid-1990s, nearly 50% of Russians were living below the poverty line, compared to just about 2% in Soviet times. And while Soviet poverty stats were often twisted for propaganda, there is no doubt that the 1990s brought a catastrophic drop in living standards for most people. Malnutrition was common, especially among children and the elderly. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies like bandages and antibiotics. Heating systems in apartment buildings broke down and weren't repaired. People were left to freeze through brutal Russian winters. Even life itself became something the people couldn't depend on. The life expectancy for Russian men dropped from 64 years in 1989 to just 57.6 years by 1994, a collapse you would normally only see in wartime or during major epidemics. Women's life expectancy also fell, though not as sharply. The mortality crisis had many causes, from the unstable economy to the sudden disappearance of the Soviet structures that people had relied on for decades. The economic collapse triggered a social breakdown that was just as devastating. When the state and economy fell apart, the result wasn't just poverty, it was a complete unraveling of social order, one that was violent, chaotic, and often deadly. There was a vacuum waiting to be filled, and organized crime didn't hesitate. Under Soviet rule, criminal groups had been relatively constrained by the KGB and the police. But when that system collapsed, the mafia moved in to fill the void. Small-time criminals banded together, growing into organized groups that carved up entire industries. The oligarchs who had grabbed up state assets during privatization couldn't be distinguished from the mafia, because in many cases they were the same people. Business disputes were settled with violence. Contract killings became routine. Between 1992 and 2005, Russia averaged well over 30,000 murders annually, with some years nearing 45,000, easily outpacing the US, which at the time was considered the murder capital of the developed world. Bank directors, business owners, politicians, and journalists were regularly assassinated in broad daylight. Car bombings were common. People started calling it bandit capitalism, and it was hard to argue with it. For ordinary Russians, this meant violence was ever present. People couldn't trust the police. They were often working with the very criminals they were supposed to stop. Bribing officials became a part of everyday life, whether you were starting a business or just trying to get your kid into a better school. The corruption that thrived in Soviet times, already widespread, grew even worse once the old systems of accountability disappeared. Meanwhile, alcoholism reached epidemic proportions. As conditions worsened, people turned to drink to cope with the psychological trauma of watching their entire world collapse. Russians were consuming an average of 32 pints of pure alcohol annually by the mid-1990s. That is more than double what the World Health Organization estimated for the European region at the time. This wasn't just people drinking too much at parties. Widespread alcohol addiction was a pandemic, destroying families and communities. Alcohol became one of the country's leading killers. In 1995, about 75% of homicide suspects were arrested while under the influence. Cardiovascular disease, often tied to heavy drinking, stress, and poor diet, became another major cause of death, driving the sudden spike in male mortality. The demographic impact of this social collapse was staggering. Russia's total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman has in her lifetime, fell from 2.0 in 1989 to just 1.16 by 1999. For context, 2.1 is the replacement level needed to keep a population stable. Russia was producing barely half of the children required to sustain itself. The country had reached the Russian cross. That's the moment when deaths began outpacing births. In 1992, Russia recorded 1.587 million births against 1.807 million deaths. a natural population decline of over 220,000 people in a single year. This negative population growth would continue for the next 15 years. An entire generation of children who should have been born in the 90s simply weren't. This still affects Russia today. Fast forward to 2020, and those missing children would have been finishing higher education and entering the workforce in their 20s, but they were never born. Women carried a particular burden during this era. When the Soviet system collapsed, so did the safety nets it provided. Things like state-funded childcare and guaranteed maternity leave. Women who wanted children faced impossible choices, trying to raise a family without knowing if they'd even get paid each month. They couldn't budget for baby formula when prices were increasing 20-fold in a year. As a result, many simply chose not to have children at all or delayed having them until conditions got better. Those conditions wouldn't improve until the 2000s, meaning an entire decade of potential births was lost. The social breakdown also devastated education and healthcare. Teachers and doctors, once respected under Soviet rule, suddenly found themselves among the poorest in society. Their salaries were meager when they were paid at all. Many talented professionals left these fields entirely, moving into businesses or emigrating. The quality of education and healthcare plummeted as a result. Hospitals that had been at least adequate in Soviet times became dangerous places where even basic hygiene wasn't guaranteed. Patients had to bring in their own bed sheets and medicine with them. For young people coming of age in the 1990s, the future looked bleak. The promise of education leading to a stable career evaporated. Universities were still functioning, but degrees didn't guarantee jobs. Instead, success seemed to go to those who were well-connected, willing to engage in corruption, or simply lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. A generation of Russians learned that hard work and education didn't matter as much as knowing the right people or being willing to bend the rules. And while the Russian society was collapsing, its political system was in chaos. The promise of democracy that had come with the end of the Soviet rule quickly gave way to instability, corruption, and eventually a return to authoritarianism. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president after the Soviet breakup, was supposed to be the face of Russian democracy. He famously stood on a tank in 1991 to oppose the coup against Gorbachev, casting himself as the reformer who would lead Russia into a new era of freedom and prosperity. Instead, his presidency became synonymous with chaos, corruption, and failure. Yeltsin's government lurched from crisis to crisis, unable to control inflation, corruption, or crime. His health was terrible, he was drunk, and he seemed increasingly detached from the suffering of ordinary Russians. The worst moment came in October 1993. Tensions between Yeltsin and the Russian parliament erupted into open conflict. Yeltsin wanted more executive power to push through economic reforms. Meanwhile, Parliament wanted to slow down or even reverse the shock therapy policies that were devastating the country. When lawmakers tried to impeach him, Yeltsin responded by dissolving Parliament, an action many saw as unconstitutional. Parliament refused to accept it, and its leaders barricaded themselves inside the Russian White House. Yeltsin ordered the military to storm the building, and on October 4th, tanks shelled it while troops attacked it. The official death toll was 187 people, though the real number was estimated to be more like 2,000. The short and long-term psychological impact was just as devastating. The images of tanks firing on the seat of Russian democracy, just 2 years after Soviet collapse, shattered any illusion of a smooth transition to stability. Yeltsin won the confrontation and rewrote the constitution, giving himself sweeping powers. The damage to Russia's democratic credibility was permanent. Yeltsin's economic policies, heavily influenced by Western advisors, were supposed to create a prosperous market economy. Instead, they created oligarchs, poverty, and a deep resentment of outside interference. Russians watched as Western consultants preached about free markets while their own living standards collapsed. The growing perception was that the West didn't actually care about Russian prosperity, they just wanted Russia weak and compliant. Fair or not, that view sank deep into the Russian psyche, and it still shapes how many Russians see the West today. Then came the 1998 financial crisis, the biggest blow to Yeltsin's leadership. The Russian government defaulted on its debt, the ruble crashed, and banks failed en masse. People who had finally started rebuilding their savings in the new economy watched them disappear overnight. The crisis was so severe that even Russians who had benefited from the 1990s reforms started to question whether the entire experiment had been a mistake. By 1999, Yeltsin's approval rating was in the single digits. He was exhausted, sick, and had lost all credibility. On December 31, 1999, in a surprise announcement, Yeltsin resigned. He handed his power over to his prime minister, a relatively unknown former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin's last act was to secure a promise from Putin: immunity from prosecution for Yeltsin and his family. Even at the very end, corruption and self-preservation were paramount. Putin promised Russians something they desperately craved: order and stability. After a decade of chaos, that message resonated. Putin presented himself as the strong leader who would restore Russia's strength and dignity. He cracked down on the most visible oligarchs, though mostly the ones who just opposed him politically. He centralized power, weakening parliament and regional governors. He restricted press freedom and civil liberties. Most Russians traumatized by the 90s were happy to accept these trade-offs in exchange for economic stability and national pride. Putin's rise also was made possible by rising oil prices in the early 2000s. This filled government coffers and allowed him to deliver on promises of better salaries, pensions, and social services. But Putin's appeal always came from the contrast with the 1990s. He kept reminding people of the chaos back then, the broken economy, the political mess, when Russia was supposed to be following Europe's lead. All the moves to remove democratic processes were framed as Putin protecting Russia and its people from returning to that chaos. The argument remains powerful in Russia today, with the country's repeated aggression against the West and Ukraine in particular. But that doesn't really explain why everyone seems to forget how Russia got here. Most stories start in the early 2000s and they pin it all on Putin. Almost no one looks back at the 1990s when the real damage was done. Modern takes tend to zero in on Putin dismantling democracy, partly because it fits the narrative the West believed after the Cold War, that it had won, that democracy and capitalism had beaten communism. But Russia's catastrophic 1990s didn't fit that neat mold. Democracy and free markets were supposed to bring prosperity and freedom, yet Russia went through a decade of poverty, violence, and social collapse. Admitting the full scale of Russia's suffering in the 90s would mean the West also had to admit something uncomfortable: that its brand of economic reform had failed spectacularly. Its victory in the Cold War came at a massive human cost for ordinary Russians. There's also a tendency in the West to focus on political and geopolitical issues rather than the lived experiences of ordinary people. People talk about the end of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical event, the collapse of a superpower, the end of the Cold War, and the expansion of NATO. But they don't talk much about what it meant for the school teacher in Novosibirsk, whose pension suddenly became worthless, or the mother in Moscow searching for milk while inflation wiped out her savings. Those human stories get lost in the big geopolitical narrative, people reduced to numbers and statistics. Another factor is that Russia did actually become increasingly authoritarian under Putin. This made it easier for Western observers to focus on Russia as a threat. The more Russia pushed back against the West, the less sympathy there was for understanding its perspective, or the roots of its resentment. It's easier to see Putin's Russia as simply authoritarian and aggressive than to face the complicated history that helped create it. After losing its superpower status, Russia was left with poverty, violence, and a deep sense of betrayal, that its leaders had sold it out to the West and taken advantage. For the average Russian, it felt like the country had fallen apart through no fault of its people. This collective trauma explains a lot about modern Russia's behavior on the world stage. When Putin talks about restoring Russia's greatness, he is speaking directly to people who lived through the 1990s, the people who are afraid of a possible round two. When Russian propaganda paints the West as hostile and hypocritical, it hits home for people who remember Western advisors preaching democracy while Russia fell into chaos. The lesson many Russians took away was simple: democracy can lead to chaos. Western policies can cut both ways, and strength and order matter more than how well the government actually performs. Life after the Soviet collapse was brutal for millions of Russians, but one man rose above it all. Watch A Day in the Life of Putin to see how the former KGB agent built his empire, or click on this video instead.